This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 897 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. I talked to Evan Silva last week about some players that we're targeting in season-long drafts this year. This week, it's all about players to avoid. And to help me discuss the topic, I brought on my good friend Rich Rebar of Sharp Football Analysis. We each came prepared with 5 players who we're generally avoiding in drafts this year. And I say generally avoiding because this is entirely dependent on cost. If these guys slip past ADP, it doesn't mean we're still avoiding them. But like last week, we go back and forth through the 10 players. But one thing I want to say is that we recorded this before this past weekend. And since then, some things have happened. Marshawn Lloyd was injured. That makes one of the recommendations less interesting. And at this moment, this is Monday night before this drops on Tuesday morning, Jahmyr Gibbs' status is totally up in the air. He apparently has a leg injury. That impacts another player that we chat about. But instead of cutting all of that out, I think there's still enough to learn about the process here. So we're keeping it all in. I think you'll learn something from this discussion. Now, before getting to that discussion, guys, if you're planning on buying the late round draft guide to help you out with your drafts this year, make sure you're taking advantage of my Underdog offer, because it quite literally will save you money. Instead of buying the guide, new Underdog users can sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com with promo code LATEROUND and get that guide sent to them for absolutely free. Just go and sign up, use promo code LATEROUND, make a deposit, and Underdog will email you the link to the guide. It's that easy. You, of course, can just go to lateround.com and buy the guide yourself, and you'll get everything you need to wrap your head around the fantasy football landscape this year. But I had to bring up that offer because you can get a discount on the guide. You get to play some best ball while also getting the late round draft guide. So check that all out on UnderdogFantasy.com. Sign up, make a deposit, and use promo code LATEROUND. Now here's my conversation with Rich Rebar. All right, Rich, this has become a yearly tradition where we do sort of a home and home type deal with our podcasts. This year we're doing players to avoid on this one. Did we do avoid or target on this one last year?
We did target on this one last year.
Okay, good. So I'm flipping it properly and correctly then. So we're doing players to avoid today. I will be doing some players to target on your show next week, but or maybe it'll release around the same time as this one. But regardless, we're gonna go back and forth, very similar or identically similar to what happened with Silva and I last week in our conversation with players to target. You name a guy, we talk about it. I name a guy, we talk about it. We each have 5 players. So let's kick it to you, Rich, with your first player to avoid this year.
My first guy, I'm going to start at quarterback. I've got a guy at each position. I feel like we always try to pick a guy at each position for both. But I'm going to start with Dak Prescott. You look at Dak, and it's kind of the inverse of why he was a buy last year. I mean, he's just due a mountain of negative regression. He had arguably the best season of his career in 2023. He led the NFL in completions, touchdown passes. He had the highest completion rate of his career. And you don't get to lead the NFL in passing touchdowns unless, some fortune kind of swung your way in that department. He led all quarterbacks with 9.7 touchdown passes over expectations, or 10 touchdowns if you want to be like, you can't throw a 7th of a touchdown. He last year he had career highs in pass attempts inside of the 10-yard line with 49. He led with pass attempts inside of the 5-yard line with 21. He had 67 pass attempts into the end zone last year. The next closest player in the NFL had 53. His previous career high in end zone passes was 45. So 22 more than that. And you look at this, how Dak Prescott able to use that to his advantage last year and outkicking his expected touchdown coverage. Over the past decade, 53.4% of all passing touchdowns in the NFL have come on throws that actually went into the end zone. The league rate last year was right on par. It's 54.3%. A little dyslexia if you get those numbers into typing. But 75% of Dak Prescott's touchdowns last year came on throws into the actual end zone. His previous high in a season was 56. 7.5%. And this trickles, I think, down from the team level where you start with the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys scored on 55% of their drives last year. Not only did that lead the league last season, but only 6 teams in the 2000s had a higher rate. Every one of those other 6 teams had a decrease in scoring rate the following season. Not one of those 6 teams came back and scored more touchdowns the following season. 4 of those 6 teams had a decrease of over double-digit touchdowns the following season. They had 48% of their drives reach the red zone or score a touchdown before the red zone. Since 2000, only 10 other teams have had a higher rate. All 10 of those teams had a rate drop the following season in that category. 7 of those 10 teams had a double-digit drop in touchdowns. And then I think from a team stance, this is arguably the weakest surrounding unit from Dak Prescott as he's had in Dallas. Obviously, we have CeeDee Lamb, but this is the worst collection of offensive line talent he's had. The guards are good. 2 question marks at tackles. They did extend Terrence Steele, but he was really bad in a lot of metrics. And then, if CeeDee Lamb were to miss any time, like this offense is a disaster waiting to happen. And then the last thing ties into something I know that you've talked about in the late round draft guide. You should definitely pick that up. Is Dak Prescott's ADP just falls into an area this year where back-end quarterbacks that aren't mobile have been like the largest pocket of trap quarterbacks for fantasy gamers who are trying to like kind of almost like roster filling at that point of the draft. Like, I'll take the next best quarterback, but you're almost better off just waiting and getting a guy like Tua a few picks later, or getting a guy like Jared Goff, or taking 2 of those guys that don't really run. So Dak Prescott for me just doesn't really check any box.
Yeah. The other thing too is that the more that I've, looked at like early season schedules and such, like Jordan Love actually opens up really, really strong. And just in terms of matchups and whatnot, he's going to go in the same range as Dak. So if you're going to go for this archetype, I'd also just opt for Jordan Love over Dak because of the opening schedule. And obviously there's a lot of upside with what we're seeing in the Packers offense. Whereas this Cowboys offense looks like there will be some regression coming. Usually when you get an MVP candidate or, an MVP himself, the next season is just hard to repeat those numbers, right? Like that's what this really comes down to. Usually those guys ran pretty pure, and that translates to fantasy football. And when you're a player like Dak who doesn't have the mobility and the rushing upside, it's really hard to maintain that year over year. So I like that call out a lot. I'm going to pivot. I won't go to quarterback quite yet. I do have a quarterback that I'll get to later, but let's switch things up a little bit. I'm going to talk about Zamir White, who I think is probably the most traditional dead zone running back that we have in fantasy football this year. He took over for Josh Jacobs at the end of last year. That's the reason why people are really into him this year, because Jacobs is gone. Zamir White had over 100 yards rushing in 2 of his final 4 games. He had 12.6 PPR points in each of those final 4 games. So you're sitting there and you're like, oh, wow, you have a high floor, decently high ceiling based on what he did down the stretch last year. Josh Jacobs is gone. What's not to like about Zamir White? I think the number one thing to not like about White is his pass catching. You go back to what he was doing at Georgia, not a pass catcher throughout his tenure there. Now I understand, he's playing alongside other pros that can catch the ball, but regardless, he didn't do much as a pass catcher. We haven't seen him do much as a pass catcher in the NFL. Even during that stretch last year, that's forcing people to put him at in the mid-range to low-end RB2 spot in the spot. He averaged a target share per game rate below 10%. Like, he wasn't being used that heavily as a pass catcher out of the backfield, even during that stretch last year where he was really good in fantasy football. Market trends don't favor Zamir White here either. He's an RB2. He didn't have an awesome prospect score, and that's something that we should always marry with like top 24 running backs. He's not a year 1 or a year 2 guy, and he's not in an ambiguous backfield. Now, you all should be targeting backfields that are more ambiguous in these middle rounds, where you have that contingent upside, you have the potential for a backfield takeover. Ask yourself, is there another player in that backfield baked into this cost of Zamir White? Is there another running back in this backfield that would not do something or play below expectation that would then catapult Zamir White into RB1 territory, let's say? Someone might say, oh, Dylan Laubie's that guy, the pass catcher that they drafted. We both like his profile, like he's a very interesting prospect, but that's not really being baked into this ADP right now. Like Zamir White at this moment is being drafted as if this is his backfield for the most part. And there's reason why middle round running backs who are standalone, who don't have a teammate until later in the draft. There's a reason they don't hit at as good of a rate as these running backs in these ambiguous backfields, is because situationally it's not that great. It's not that kind. And you look at the Raiders as a team, that offense, potentially a bottom 10 offense this year. I think most would project them to be a bottom 10 offense. Now, I do think the defense is okay enough to sort of keep them in games and keep, pretty boring, low scoring, probably run heavy games. And that might favor White a little bit. But this team's going to run few plays and run pretty slow. And it's not going to be an efficient offense. So you bring it all together, not a pass catcher, not an ambiguous backfield. You're not going to see him getting a ton of scoring opportunities in an offense like this. And it's an offense that's probably not going to run a ton of plays. I don't see where the ceiling is going to come from with Zamir White. And, John Daigle said it when he came on Late Round Perspectives a month or two ago. But this kind of looks like this year's Alexander Mattison, in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't mind that shout at all. To me, it just comes down to kind of what you led with as your, kind of crux of your argument, is it feels like a very hit small pick. Like even if you were to thread that needle, whereas you have other running backs going around him, Raheem Mostert, Jonathan Brooks, you go down to Tajay Spears, the two Titans guys, or and it's like you can make an argument till you see an outcome. It's like, well, if in this 10% of upside outcome, like this is a player that's actually winning me games, whereas like Zamir White's a guy, he feels like even if you hit and he's not a bust, you're treading water with the pick. And then you have to have some fragility with his usage last year. In the games under Antonio Pierce, the Raiders had a 48% drop back rate when leading on the scoreboard, which was 29th in the league. They went up to 65.5%, which is 18th in the league when they were trailing on the scoreboard, which is a pretty sizable jump. And that matters here because when you look at the Raiders' wins last year, when Antonio Pierce took over as head coach, they had the one quality win against the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes. But remember, they didn't complete a pass for the final 3 quarters of that game.
Yeah, right.
Really weird.
Right.
It was a Christmas Day game, I think.
It was a very strange game.
And then the other quarterbacks they beat were Tommy DeVito after he took over for a Daniel Jones that tore his ACL, Zach Wilson, Easton Stick, and Jarrett Stidham.
Yep.
It's just hard to predict the kind of game scripts that led to what that run out was for White last year, where he was able to stack touches. When White was on the field for the Raiders, they ran the ball 52% of the time. When Josh Jacobs was on the field for the Raiders, they ran the ball 46% of the time. The only running backs that had a higher rate of runs per snap when a team was leading was Najee Harris, Tyler Algier, Kenneth Walker, and Derrick Henry. This is the team that has a 6.75 implied win total. It's ahead of just the Titans, the Broncos, and the Patriots. He's not going to catch passes. It seems like even if you hit, you're not really gaining a lot.
That's the thing. I think a lot of these picks that we're going to talk about today do stem from our philosophical, or the way that we view the game, right? And philosophically, how we view the game.
Running backs.
Right, exactly. That's why, honestly, in my rankings, people are going to look at them and say, "Man, you're really low on Zamir White," because I have both Cincinnati backs and both Tennessee backs ranked ahead of Zamir White. And the reason for that is the upside case. It's the fact that one of those guys in those backfields could emerge. And if one of them emerges, that player is going to be a lot more valuable in fantasy football than White will. And there's multiple ways that those guys can emerge. You can do it through injury or through talent, whereas there's not much of an upside case for White. And that's the way that I approach fantasy football and play fantasy football. And so, if I'm playing the game for a rankings contest, if I'm trying to see, if I think, Zamir White, where he goes at like RB 23 or 22 or 21, wherever, he can match that ADP. That's fine. I just don't think he's going to get much higher than that at the end of the season, even if things do go his way. That's what this really comes down to.
He had an optical outcome and his highest weekly finish was RB 12.
Exactly.
That's fine. That's fine. And it's great when you pick up off waivers too. Like he was a great waiver.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's the other, I do think that part of it is like psychological for people because they won leagues because of him or with his help last year, at least. I shouldn't say because again, the ceiling wasn't like so tremendously high, but maybe there's a little bit of an attachment that some people have towards White. And not only that, the dude is a freak. Like he's a monster. He is a large man that, you look at and you're like, how could he not score fantasy points? But
hey, Andre Williams, baby.
Yeah, that's a good point. Anyway, give us your second player to avoid.
Since you did Zamir White, I think I'm going to go to his incumbent, right?
Let's do it.
Yeah, I got Josh Jacobs and a lot of similar reasons here. And I think when you look at Josh Jacobs and the total product that we've had of his career, because I do think there's an upside outcome for Josh Jacobs, but we really have a sample where he's been more of an RB2 for his career, and that 2022 season is the outlier, right?
Yes.
Like in terms of everything, all the metrics of efficiency and, fantasy points, production, the rate of long runs, everything. And I do think there will be some give and take here, playing in a better offense in Green Bay than he did with Las Vegas. But I mean, all of his efficiency metrics line up with his other 3 years. And I have kind of correlated this. I think that his 2022 season reminds me very much like the 2014 season that DeMarco Murray had. And DeMarco Murray ended up bouncing back and having one more good year over the course of his career, but was largely what he had been prior to that point, which was like a solid RB2 type of running back. And that's what I believe Jacobs is. I think he's very much in the ilk of like a Najee Harris, right? And then now we're not only taking him and saying, all right, well, we're going to put him in a better offense, right? And that's going to be fine. But now his workload is a little bit compromised. No matter what you think about Marshawn Lloyd, Matt LaFleur has already openly come out and says, like, he's a big believer top down that you need multiple running backs to touch the football per game. With the Raiders, Jacobs didn't play third downs at all. Something we're kind of already expecting, kind of probably Lloyd to do at minimum. And we'll see if like AJ Dillon does anything. But Jacobs still didn't share any backfield touches because of that. I mean, Amir Abdullah didn't come in and get touches. He just played on third down. Jacobs has averaged 69.7% of his team rushing attempts per game played to his career to this point. Last year before injury, he was at 77.5%. Over the 5 years that LaFleur's been in Green Bay, a Green Bay running back has accounted for 75% or more of the team runs just 5 times in a regular season game. Just 14 times over the 83 games that he's coached has a running back had over 2/3 of the team runs in a game. Now Jacobs wasn't a part of those teams, and we're betting that, he still like is going to be the lead guy, but all those things paired with like his efficiency, like, he's still guys that's needed volume to cover. I mean, that year he had that awesome year, he had 393 touches. If you're looking for a guy to be Derrick Henry, that's a thin line to like kind of cover. And then the Packers in general are kind of a weird team because a lot of people are expecting them to be better and build on what they did the back half of the year. But they have some other kind of like statistical stuff that's going to be hard to roll over. The Green Bay Packers converted 95% of their goal to go possessions for touchdowns last year. Not only did that lead the league, it was the highest rate for any team that's available for the data. We don't have it all the way since the 2000s. There were 5 other teams in the 2000s that converted at 90% or higher of their goal-to-goal drives and the touchdowns. All of them had a drop in that rate the following season, and all scored fewer touchdowns overall the following season. So we believe he's entering a better offense, and he is from a talent perspective. But the Packers are another team, like we can't just say are going to score all these touchdowns. They could easily score fewer touchdowns and still be a good team.
To me, Jacobs has been an easy fade. Just at cost, especially in like home leagues and stuff. Like if you've been drafting on Underdog all summer, you've seen his ADP fall pretty dramatically. Like he was a 3-4 turn guy. Now he's like mid-5th, even late 5th at times type player. I also think that, you and I probably agree that like running back data, like individual running back data can be pretty noisy year to year. So like, I don't like to use that as like the crux of an argument, but I don't think we can totally ignore how rough Jacobs was as a runner last season. When you look at some of his efficiency metrics, it's like his burst wasn't there at all. He only gained 10 or more yards on 3.9% of his rushes, which was not only by far the lowest of his career, that was the lowest rate of gaining 10 or more yards by any 200 plus attempt running back since 2011. I mean, there are numbers that suggest that he just was not himself last season. Now, maybe, it was just a situational thing, and Vegas not being very strong offensively. I get all of that, but he's played in the league for a handful of years now. I know that he was a younger prospect coming in, so age-wise, it might not look as bad, but I do think there are some question marks there. And then you mentioned the stuff with LaFleur and the backfield and splitting the backfield. I mean, LaFleur's the coach that was splitting the Tennessee backfield when he had Derrick Henry and Dion Lewis. Derrick Henry wasn't Derrick Henry, then as he is now. But even when Henry started to really turn things on during the second half of that season, when he was splitting touches with Dion Lewis, it took them like a month and a half to finally give Derrick Henry the keys to that backfield and to just let him do his thing, right? It wasn't really until Arthur Smith where Derrick Henry was able to be Derrick Henry, the guy that's a Hall of Famer, borderline Hall of Famer. I have no idea. I don't want to get into that kind of discussion. But yeah, I mean, I think that through their actions, through Green Bay's actions, they're telling us that they want to have a split backfield. They draft Marshawn Lloyd. I remember Evan Silva on one of the ETR podcasts talking about how there was, I don't know if it was a rumor or not, but Evan was mentioning how when they got rid of Aaron Jones, Matt LaFleur got Josh Jacobs thinking that they were going to have Aaron Jones also in that backfield. Yeah. Because they would have this tandem because that's the way that LaFleur likes to run his offenses. Then what did Green Bay do? They get Marshawn Lloyd, who at the very least, Rich, Marshawn Lloyd is probably the perfect kind of change of pace back, at the very least. Like, is he going to be a bell cow someday?
He's also very Aaron Jones-ish. Like,
yeah, he is. Yeah, exactly. You have he's a really, really explosive back. He can catch pass out of the back. He can do the things that Aaron Jones did. And that's the fear. Like, everyone's saying Josh Jacobs could be Aaron Jones plus. What if Josh Jacobs is more of the early down guy that we've seen, in these offenses historically, and that caps him as well? I mean, there's just a lot of ways that this can go south. There are some ways that it can go favorably for Jacobs, as you noted, but I think there's just a lot of them that can go south.
I mean, he goes 10 picks on average ahead of Joe Mixon, and every pro argument you would make for Josh Jacobs, you would make for Joe Mixon.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a really, really good point. All right, my next guy that I'm going to go with, this is kind of a philosophical thing more than anything else, because when you look at where this guy's drafted versus what our projections look like, we're not going to sit here and say, he can't meet expectation. I absolutely think that he can. But we're going to go to wide receiver. I'm going to go to Courtland Sutton. So Courtland Sutton, Rich, has never finished as a top 24 wide receiver in PPR points per game throughout his entire career. He's never done it. His season high in PPR points per game, 13.9. That came during his second year in the league. He's had injuries and such that's derailed his career a little bit since then. But he ranked 27th in scoring that year, and he hasn't really been close ever since. He's not a bad receiver, but across this fairly large sample, he's shown us that he's probably not like a special wideout, right? He was targeted on fewer than 20% of his routes last year, so that's a pretty weak number, especially in a situation that wasn't that competitive overall. He finished with a 1.65 yards per route run rate. Fine. There's just so many numbers that point to him just being a fine wide receiver. His target share last year, just over 20%. All of those numbers are just fine. So, you look at where he's being ranked. He's wide receiver 44-ish over on like a Fantasy Pro site. It's usually where he'll get drafted as well. But he's going ahead of a lot of the higher end, especially in home leagues, he'll go ahead of a lot of the higher end rookie wideouts. Like if you look at, you could even throw, I know that this is not the case on Underdog, but like Rome Odunze will go later than Courtland Sutton. Brian Thomas, who I think both of us are into, will go later than Courtland Sutton. To me, I'm throwing those darts way before I'm throwing the Courtland Sutton one, because Sutton at the end of the day is not going to be a league-winning player for me. Look what he did last year, finding the end zone as many times as he did, and he wasn't a league-winning player. And so the opportunity cost is still, it's not significant where he goes, but you can still get some really solid running backs, some of the guys that I'm talking about in these ambiguous backfields, but also some of these rookie wideouts who historically have hit at a very, very high rate in that range and in those rounds. And so I just don't think that Courtland Sutton is going to be a guy that burns you at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's another thing where you look at the ADP of Courtland Sutton and you say, all right, well, he's the first wide receiver on his team. I'm getting him at pick, wide receiver, 40 to 50. Why wouldn't I just do that? I'm getting a team's lead wide receiver. Well, historically, those guys have not been really that good either. I just put out an ADP article. I'm sure you've done this similar work too. Since 2010, there's been 169 wide receivers who were the first wide receiver for their team, but were taken outside of the top 24 at the position. Only 40% of those wide receivers matched their ADP, just meeting ADP expectations. And of that same group, only 18 of them turned into wide receiver 1 scoring season. 23% of those guys finish as a wide receiver 2 or better. Then when you look at the player himself, I mean, he's coming off of a really down year that I don't think people understand. It was a down year because he scored so many touchdowns. He only averaged 48 receiving yards per game last year. He scored 10 touchdowns and was the wide receiver 40 in PPR points per game. 47% of his red zone targets went for touchdown, the highest rate of his career. His previous career high was 25%. He had 8 red zone touchdowns last year after he had 7 his first 5 years in the league. He converted 60% of his end zone targets for touchdowns after 25%. And then I think the biggest thing that hurts Courtland Sutton right now is their current defensive meta isn't just geared towards where he wins. I mean, last year he was still really good in one-on-one situations. Against man coverage, 2.37 yards per out run and was targeted on 24% of his routes. But against zone, 1.47 yards per out run, 17.6% target rate per route run. The NFL meta is just geared around to stop dudes like Courtland Sutton right now. He's not like a huge target runner in like terms of NFL nuance. He's a big dude that if he's one-on-one, you let him win. And that's kind of really hard to lean on those guys. So I'm with you on this one. I actually don't think I've drafted Courtland Sutton at all because, like you said, at that point, when I'm drafting bench receivers, I'm trying to find avenues to how could this guy be a wide receiver 2 or better? And it's really hard to justify the upside outcome for Sutton getting there, a guy who's been inside of the top 40 in points per game once over his NFL career at this point.
Yeah, absolutely crazy. And the other thing, too, last year with Sutton's touchdown totals, a lot of that just came down to the fact that Denver threw for, or when Denver scored a touchdown, they threw for that touchdown. They had a touchdown ratio when you're looking at pass to rush touchdowns of 78%, which is a really high number. And that's a number that typically regresses year over year, which you could maybe make the case for like a running back there or something. But, you know, I think the offense in general is just going to look a lot different, obviously, with the quarterback change and the way they operate. And that's not necessarily a good thing for Courtland Sutton. All right, Rich, number 3, let's hear it.
Yeah, my number 3 is another running back, I think, in the same kind of archetype of the guys we've kind of covered to this point. Maybe catches a couple more passes, and that's Ramondre Stevenson. And like you said, I'm not really knocking him for his inefficiency last year. I mean, he was hyper efficient in 2022. That kind of regresses in 2023. That's stuff like I'm not really cared about. When I look at Ramondre Stevenson, though, I look at what his role is, his offensive environment, and his draft cost, right? And it's just hard for me to get there for the pure octane upside example. We have to factor in so far that he's caught some passes in the NFL, but they've been like in a Leonard Fournette type fashion. Like he's caught passes, but they've done absolutely nothing good that should warrant that he should continue to catch passes. He's averaged just 6.1 and 6.3 yards per catch over the past 2 seasons. But you get a guy like Antonio Gibson now who's brought in, who definitely isn't going to jump Ramondre Stevenson. You see the contract that Stevenson got, but Antonio Gibson has increased his receptions and his yards per reception every year in the NFL. This is a guy, it's a proven pass catcher. You all know, you've heard the stories that he was a wide receiver in college. And so what if Stevenson doesn't retain that long down and distance role in this offense? That is going to matter on a team like New England because they are already outright projected to have the number 1 pick next season. This is why they can't trade their first for Brandon Ayuk. They also, to compound this, they play our hardest projected schedule at Sharp Football Analysis that we have in the NFL. They still have questions on their offensive line, and they project to be a bottom 8 scoring team in the NFL. So you might say, all right, like in the Zamir White angle, it feels fine. But it feels like we're attempting to kind of thread the needle through all these potential hangups just to get like an ADP match, like an outcome to where Ramondre finished as an RB2 and I drafted him as an RB2, so I should feel good about it. There's just not a lot here I can signal that says like we're going to get an RB1 season from him.
I don't put a ton of weight in contracts either. I don't know about you, but with running back contracts especially, we have to always keep in mind that the most recent contract is going to be the most lucrative contract, right? Because we get an increased cap every year. They're going to be able to spend a little bit more. So when DeAndre Swift or Ramondre Stevenson sign these quote big deals, that's partially based on cap, right? Partially based on the way that things are trending in the NFL, but also it's still a small number in the grand scheme of things, right? Like running backs are still not getting paid that much. So if you're going to say it's a massive contract because this guy gets $8 million and this guy gets $5 million, the delta still isn't that significant at the end of the day. And I think we need to keep that in mind, at least with these running backs, right? And, you mentioned the Antonio Gibson factor. He's seen a 9.5% target share per game every year of his career. I mean, it's not like he's a zero in that department. There hasn't been, at least I haven't seen any like massive coach speak surrounding Antonio Gibson, or like, the fact that like he's going to play this massive role in the offense. But I do have a lot of concern about Stevenson on the pass catching side and in offense that could be trailing and not very good.
Because really his only good fantasy sample we have so far was out of necessity. Like he had a workload through necessity. Right. And if that's compromised even to a degree, we have to question if he, again, fits on that Zamir White spectrum, because he's going in that area of the draft where he's around, Aaron Jones, he's around James Conner, he's around Najee Harris, right? Like guys who could have similar roles, but are just in better environments.
Yeah, exactly. To me, like a player like Najee Harris will probably see a similar role projection-wise as Ramondre Stevenson, but he has crazy contingent upside with Jaylen Warren. If Jaylen Warren were to go down, and I, as bearish as some might be with like the Pittsburgh offense, and for the record, we're recording this before anything goes down with Brandon Ayuk. So if something happens with Brandon Ayuk, over the weekend, because we have to record this before we go to the Fantasy Football Expo. But if anything goes down with Brandon Ayuk, this is recorded before the Ayuk potential move. But regardless, like the Pittsburgh offense is still projected to be better than the New England offense. Number one, there should be more scoring opportunities for a guy like Najee, but there is that contingent upside. There's really not that to a strong degree. I mean, you do have more, I think, with Ramondre versus like a Zamir White, because if Antonio Gibson goes down, you'll see a potential bell cow workload for Ramondre, but it's still a pretty crappy offensive environment overall. All right. I'm going to go to quarterback now. Since I brought up the 49ers, I'm going to bring up Brock Purdy. Now, this is partially a game theory thing, because if you look at the way that rankings work and that tiers are sort of formulating, he is a pocket passer at the top of that giant cluster of pocket passers. You named some of them earlier with like a Goff or a Tua. I think you could even throw like a Stafford in there, and Kirk Cousins, and maybe even Aaron Rodgers, because we're shooting for, we only care about upside in single quarterback season long leagues, especially that late. So there's just a lot of those kinds of players, and I don't think Brock Purdy is special enough to really automatically separate himself the way that rankings are kind of showing. So, if you look at San Francisco, the system, of course, brilliant. The weapons in San Francisco, with or without Ayuk, very, very strong. But Purdy's coming off a season where he had a 7% touchdown rate. It was like 6.95% or something like that. So it was about a 7% touchdown rate for Brock Purdy last year. There have only been 20 seasons since 2011 where a quarterback had 300 or more pass attempts and a 7% touchdown rate or better, and only 4 quarterbacks have been able to do that more than once, those 4 being Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, and Drew Brees. Now, I know that Purdy has been above that mark throughout his career, and so people will say, well, if he regresses to his mean, technically his touchdown rate's actually been 7.2% throughout his career. It's been better than what he did last season. But I'm not going to bet on Brock Purdy giving us the most historic touchdown rate in NFL history throughout his career. It's just not a worthy bet in my opinion. But not only that, last year he has a borderline MVP season. Like he was an MVP candidate until like week 13 or 14 last year.
That weekly dichotomy was a ton of fun.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you see that every freaking Monday talking about Brock Purdy and his MVP chatter. But despite him having sort of like a very pure, ran really hot season, he averaged 18.5 points per game. Like it wasn't even like he was giving you high-end QB1 production. I think that I would understand this a little bit more if it were like a Mahomesian pass-heavy, we could see it with a little bit of rushing, but we could see that top 3 outcome. Even in a situation in a season where he gave us like arguably one of the best seasons that we'll probably see Brock Purdy play. I know that's hard to hear for some people, but that's kind of how we see it statistically. It's not that he can't get better as a quarterback in general, but statistically, it's going to be really, really hard for him to match what he did last season. He was still a lower end QB1 in points per game, maybe a mid-range QB1 depending on your scoring. So to me, he's fine like in a vacuum, Purdy. Like like if you're in a single quarterback league where, like we're in our Apex draft that we do every year with a bunch of fantasy analysts, and quarterbacks are going to go a lot later, and Purdy could end up going in like round 14 where the opportunity cost just doesn't matter whatsoever. But where he's being ranked, I don't see the need to get Purdy when you can find that kind of play
3 or 4 rounds later, if not more. I mean, you could realistically make the case that Will Levis has just as high of upside this year as Brock Purdy does. Like, you can make the argument in the way that they're scoring. Like, Will Levis gives us a Jameis Winston type season, right? Like, where he's throwing it down the field. Sure, there's turnovers, but Tennessee's offense looks better than we think. And a lot of those touchdowns that they score end up being passing touchdowns. And then the opposite kind of happens for San Francisco. And I haven't even talked about the fact that San Francisco's touchdowns per game number, that's going to regress year over year as well. We very, very rarely, teams that have scored over 3.3 touchdowns per game since 2011, there's been 26 of them with next season data. 25 of the 26 saw that number drop year over year. That includes both Detroit and Miami this year as well, but San Francisco was well above that mark, over 3.5. So there's just a lot of reasons as to why Brock Purdy isn't really a necessary get this year.
Yeah, I like that shout. Obviously, you look at, you brought up over the last 30 years. I mean, we've had 2 quarterbacks have a 7% or higher touchdown rate in back-to-back seasons, other outside of here. Aaron Rodgers, you brought up, and then Dave Craig in 1987 to 1988. For some context, Patrick Mahomes has had 1 season of his career with a 7% touchdown rate. He was the best, thought of as the best player in the NFL. No quarterback's gone 3 years in a row. So yeah, there should be some regression there. You look at, Purdy, how he got there too, just running pure. I mean, he was 18th in red zone expected points scored and was 8th overall. He was 11th in red zone pass attempts, but 29.7% of his touchdowns, those passes went for touchdowns. It was by far the highest rate in the league. He only threw 21 total passes all year into the actual end zone, which is 21st in the NFL, but 57% of them went for touchdowns, the highest rate in the league. The league average was 34.8%. Purdy threw a touchdown on 4.5% of his non-end zone throws. Think about this, because this is the 49ers game, right? Like the NFL average was 2%, so he more than doubled it.
Yeah.
So I like that shout. And then the biggest thing you brought up is even running as pure as he did last year, he had 2 top 3 scoring weeks.
Yeah, he the ceiling just isn't there for these kinds of players, and it's just not worthwhile to spend any sort of dramatic capital. I know that I made that Levis shout and I made that comparison, and I'm not saying from a median outcome standpoint that they both look the same. They don't at all. I'm saying if things hit right for a Will Levis and things hit sort of a median outcome and maybe below median outcome for Brock Purdy, it's really not hard to see a guy like Levis or a guy like Aaron Rodgers or some of these guys who go, or Geno Smith is another one. Mm-hmm. Some of these guys who are going significantly later to match this kind of production. This is how you arbitrage the quarterback position. Yeah. You either get a rusher, or if you're getting a pocket passer, you can get multiple of them to just make sure that you're increasing your odds that you get that outlier touchdown rate season, that you get that player, that one or two guys who end up, really overperforming as throwers, like we saw with like a Dak or like a Jordan Love down the stretch last year. Mm-hmm. You can throw multiple darts to increase your probability, but if you're only getting one, I mean, I don't see the need to just get that dude and get Purdy when other guys have a very similar ceiling who go later.
Yep.
All right, 4th guy, Rich, let's hear it.
All right. The last 2 are kind of spicier. So I had to get him. The first guy I have is Michael Pittman out of these last 2. And it's really just Pittman, kind of everyone just ignored what happened last year because his ADP just kind of went right back to where it was, right? Some people were like, oh, what's going to happen with Pittman with a rookie quarterback or an inaccurate quarterback? And everyone's like, oh, he just caught 100 passes. So we'll just go back to take him. But it happened without, and he's back in the environment where everyone was worried about. Yeah. And we didn't really get to see it except for a tiny, small sample. And when you look at it right now, the duo of Anthony Richardson and Michael Pittman only connected on 59.1% of their targets, 6.5 yards per target, while Pittman caught 71.6% of his targets from Gardner Minshew for 7.5 yards per target. So if Pittman falls into a spot where I can, I go wide receiver heavy and he can be my wide receiver 3 or my flex on aggressive wide receiver heavy builds, I actually, that insulates him more where I can say all right, that usually never happens because he goes in the top 24 of the position. Yeah. Because again, he's another guy that just doesn't have the massive spike week potential. So these situations where he's a wide receiver 2 or better, I mean, I'm working with a lot of trepidation. I mean, what we saw from Anthony Richardson last year was exactly the player he was in college when we raised all these questions. I mean, he was unbelievably terrible in accuracy, especially to quarterbacks. I mean, he was 45th among all quarterbacks in accuracy rate throws to wide receivers last year. And I brought up those splits, that Pittman had with and without him. So like that still exists in his range of outcomes. Like he's going to be playing with an inaccurate quarterback on a team that's probably going to throw maybe 500 passes. And if you want to even say Shane Steichen gets it and he was more aggressive with Jalen Hurts, like, I mean, maybe 550, like it's gonna be a low volume passing offense for sure. Like if you're projecting this out any way to dice it, if you're projecting Anthony Richardson to be healthy, it's just going to be a low volume passing offense. I will say that one pro for Pittman that does give me a little bit of pause of just like outright fading him completely is that he does get a lot of targets out of that RPO play action game. Yeah. And we know that those targets are viable. I mean, only Tyreek Hill had more targets out of play action than he did last year. So that's like, he could have some roster or some fantasy efficiency smoothing type targets if he's not going to get a lot of targets, but we're still banking on Richardson to buck a 6-year sample of him playing football that he's not a good thrower of the football. Yeah. And even if you want to overlap Shane Steichen to Jalen Hurts actually has a really strong passing efficiency profile exiting college and what he's done in the NFL night and day from Anthony Richardson's. So, I mean, I'm just saying that everyone's looking at what they were operating with trepidation with Pittman last year and just ignoring it all when it all exists again and it exists in totality again this year.
Yeah. I mean, like it's weird, but the starting quarterback going down last year for Pittman was actually not a bad thing. It was a good thing because they were able to change the offense up a little bit. Obviously Indianapolis is going to run more plays than the average team just in terms of pace and the way they operate that offense. But and the RPO stuff I do think has there's I've talked about on the show. Ben Gretsch has done research on it and how like top wide receivers, just given the nature of what an RPO is, top wide receivers get a little bit of that target share bump and boost just because of what that RPO is. You got to make that decision very quickly, and it's usually going to that top wide out. But I have my concerns as well. He's one of those players where you stare at him when you're drafting, and then you just never feel super, super comfortable clicking his name, or at least I haven't throughout the offseason. I've gotten some, I'm not outright fading, but it's definitely a situation where I'm getting him when he falls more than like forcing the issue. But maybe, the Josh Downs injury, maybe that lingers because it is a high ankle. Maybe that forces some targets to go Pittman's way a little bit more, but I hear you. I definitely have very, very similar concerns. I'm going to go with kind of I think it's a cheapie. Dalton Schultz at tight end is the next player to avoid. With a healthy wide receiver room, Dalton Schultz, number 4 option in this Texans offense, as a receiver, there's really no reason to project him to be better than like a Tank Dell. I mean, this guy's like a borderline dad running tight end. He's not this like uber effective, uber athletic tight end. Last year, he had a yards per route run rate of 1.47. His target share per game was actually under 18%, and that's in an offense that had a banged up Tank Dell, throughout the season. So now you add Stephon Diggs, you have Tank Dell there who's healthy. Obviously, Nico Collins has become the alpha that they need. I just think that he's a floor pick, right? Like you're associating him with a good offense, and you're saying, oh, I'll get some touchdowns from him. That's fine enough. Whereas you can make that argument for a lot of guys. Like I'm having a very hard time understanding this ADP when you can get a younger guy in Luke Musgrave just a little bit later in another pretty good offense and take the chance and roll the dice a little bit to see if he emerges in a wide receiving group, in a pass catching group that's relatively, overall ambiguous. And honestly, if you want to just get like a floor play at tight end, just wait even longer. Just get a Hunter Henry type, like a guy who's going to probably be touchdown dependent and, more of a focal point in his offense just because there's a lack of alternatives versus what Dalton Schultz is dealing with in Houston. There's just a lot of tight ends you can get later in your draft that have a legit shot to just straight up outscore Dalton Schultz this year. I mean, you could even go to like Mike Gesicki if you wanted to and say, what if they figure it out, they play him at big slot, they give him more reps than we expect, whatever, And he's in a powerful offense too, without the three-headed monster that Dalton Schultz is dealing with. You get the two guys in Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins. I just think there's a lot of tight ends that you can throw the dart at late that are way more favorable than a guy like Dalton Schultz. Even a guy that's going right next to him in rankings, Pat Freiermuth, and an offense that targets the you-know-what out of tight ends. This Arthur Smith offense has been top 8. I talked about it last week. Top 8 in tight end target share every year that he's been a coach, an offensive coordinator or head coach in the NFL. I mean, Pat Freiermuth to me, again, pre-Brandon Ayuk trade potential. But Pat Freiermuth, even probably with Ayuk, would be a more attractive play, I think, than someone like Dalton Schultz. I just don't really understand Dalton Schultz's ADP.
Yeah, in tight ends that are have 2 wide receivers drafted ahead of them, and he has 3.
Yes,
have an ultra low hit rate and an ultra low ceiling. Where is Dalton Schultz on the dad runner scale? If you were to slide him in, where would he be?
Probably a 3.5 out of 10. Or I guess no, dad runner, it goes in the opposite direction. So probably like a 6.5 to 7 out of 10, probably around there. I mean, he's got some juice because we've seen some tight ends. Not be able to get down the field very quick whatsoever. But yeah, I mean, like he's definitely high on that scale.
Yeah, I just don't think a lot of people realize too the rotation of players that Houston had last year at wide receiver. Tank Dell and Nico Collins, never mind the fact that we're adding Stephon Diggs here. Tank Dell and Nico Collins were only on the field together for 34% of CJ Stroud's dropbacks last year. Yeah. Like that's it, a third of his dropbacks. Yeah. That's like how banged up they were. And that aided a guy. And Schultz, even with all that going on, was 13th at the position in target rate per route run.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like he wasn't, he had still a sub 18% target share despite fighting for targets with Noah Brown. It's like this isn't this this just doesn't.
Xavier Hutchinson.
Yeah, like where are these looks going to come from with Dalton Schultz? Again, yes, he could score touchdowns. There could be some touchdown dependency there, and a good offense that I think if we were to place our bets on which offense is going to throw the most touchdowns this year, Houston would easily be top 5. But I don't know if that necessarily translates to Dalton Schultz scoring 8. I'm very, very concerned about his outlook. All right, we got one more guy from you, Rich. This one's probably the spiciest on your list, and people are probably going to hate you and troll you for it, but let's hear it.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into what you kind of laid out, right? Like we want to pick these players at positions, and I do think the tight end market is really strong this year, but I don't want to. This isn't an outright player I'm avoiding, but I am avoiding taking him as the tight end 1 and where he is at ADP, and it's Sam Laporta. It hurts. Love Sam Laporta as a prospect. Love him as a player. I think everything about his situation that he was already a good performer in it exists in year 2. But when you look at last year, I mean, paying top dollar for a guy like Sam Laporta just inherently doesn't make a lot of sense. Although he was the tight end 1 in overall scoring last year, it was the lowest scoring tight end 1 in PPR format since 2017. He provided almost no positional leverage. All of Evan Ingram, Travis Kelce, and TJ Hawkinson had at least 90% or more of the production that Laporta had, and those guys, a lot of them missed time, Hawkinson and Kelce. Kelce and Hawkinson actually scored more points per game than him. He was the only tight end 1 scorer overall in PPR formats the first 30 years that actually wasn't first in points per game. The first time ever. And then when you look at he is also a guy that we do have to factor in, as good as he was as a rookie, and we expect him to get better. There probably is going to be some pullback on how efficient he was. And remember, he didn't even have 1,000 yards last year. 25.1% of his fantasy points came via touchdowns last year. It was the third highest among all top tight ends in 24. Hunter Henry's at 30%. Mark Andrews was at 26.6%. He scored 4.4 touchdowns over expectation. It was the most in the NFL of any tight end last season. He scored more points over expectation in the red zone than any tight end at the position. 54% of his red zone targets went for touchdowns, the highest percent of all players that had double-digit targets. 50% of his end zone targets went for touchdowns. The average conversion rate for tight ends is 43.2%. So, I mean, it's just one of these things. Like, what kind of position? It's a good player. He plays indoors in Detroit. You've heard all the splits, even though Detroit only plays 2 more games outdoors than they did last year. But everyone's running wild with this Jared Goff thing. Amon-Ra is the lead target, but after that, it's pretty nebulous. We expect him to be second on the team in targets. Like, all those are fine. Like, I think Laporta is a player I would want on my rosters if it wasn't attached to this tight end 1 draft cost and a 3rd round to 4th round price tag. Especially just because I think that, like you said, I think literally when you look at the top 10 tight ends in ADP, I think it's pretty tight. I think that's a pretty tightly packed group. And so he's a guy by default, like the player, like the situation. I don't really have a lot of pull downs other than the touchdown regression stuff, but I just don't see any advantage to taking him as the tight end 1.
I don't see a difference between him to Kelsey to Trey McBride to Mark Andrews, really. Like, I think that if we were to throw them in a hat and say, hey, I'm going to pull out the tight end 1 this year, I think we'd probably give pretty equal odds to each of those players. Like genuinely, it just doesn't seem like he is separating himself nearly enough. And then going back to what I said earlier, Detroit is a favorable offense, will play in domes, but we can't ignore that they ran pretty hot last year. They had 3.3 touchdowns per game. And I gave you that stat earlier about how teams that have that high of touchdowns per game rates, they almost always score fewer touchdowns the next year. It doesn't matter what these teams do to boost their offense and make it better. Not that Detroit really did that much, but it doesn't really matter what happens there. It's just a very, very hard thing to repeat. That's what regression's all about. And so I agree with you. I don't think that I think it's fine that he's the tight end 1 for people. Like, I don't have like a huge issue if you want to rank him tight end 1. The problem that I have is that oftentimes you can get like a round or 2 discount from him to some of these other tight ends who have just this, have a very similar outlook as him. I just don't really understand that.
Yeah, he goes a full round and a half over Mark Andrews, right? Right. Who's going to be the lead target in his offense, or we just project him to be. Right. There's definitely Zay Flowers there. Dalton Kincaid, we project to probably be the lead target.
Yep.
So it's a lot. Like I said, I look at those top 10 tight ends, and it's hard to, like I said, I'm picking nits here, basically.
Sure. People might get upset, but I think that from a cost perspective, because all of this is versus cost. Like, we're not saying you can't draft Sam Laporta or that Sam Laporta is bad. It's just where he's going in drafts that's questionable. I'm going to stick with that team for this last guy. I think this is kind of spicy too, because people are ranking him pretty high and they're drafting him pretty high. I'm going to go with David Montgomery. I was on the Yahoo podcast with Matt Harmon, and we were talking about players that we're targeting and avoiding, and I did it based on the Yahoo ADP, and David Montgomery was like RB16 over there, which to me is just sensationally high. Like, I think he's a low-end RB2. I'm talking like in that RB24, RB22 to 24 type range. When you lay everything out and you look at the market trends that I've studied and such with these running backs, David Montgomery checks 0 boxes, right? Like, he's an RB2. He's not a middle round running back, technically. He's an RB2 by ADP. And when I talk middle round running backs, I always say middle round running backs who have top 12 running backs on their team, teammates, like a Kareem Hunt when he was playing with Nick Chubb for all those years in Cleveland. They very, very, very rarely become what I consider moderate breakouts, or players who outperform ADP expectation by 3 or more PPR points per game. Now, people will say, well, Kareem Hunt did it. Kareem Hunt really didn't give us that high of a ceiling throughout his time in Cleveland when Nick Chubb, playing alongside with Nick Chubb. We don't often see RB2s with RB1 teammates. It's happened 4 times since 2014, but 3 of the 4 guys who are part of that group, they played below ADP expectation by at least 1.5 PPR points per game. The one player who exceeded expectation was Mark Ingram, and he only did it by 0.5 point per game. So we're not seeing, at least in the small sample, this type of player, given the teammate situation, emerge very well. And obviously it's because he has an RB1 on his team. The RB1 is going to command touches. That's really what this comes down to and what this data tells us. But if you then look at another thing that we always look for is target share. We want a player to see a lot of looks through the air, whether it be an RB2 or an RB3, really any running back, but in particular for argument purposes, we're looking at these RB2s. He's not a pass catcher. He had or at least in this offense, he's not a pass catcher. He was a little bit in Chicago. He had a 5.1% target share per game rate last season. That's with obviously Jahmyr Gibbs in the picture. Jahmyr Gibbs being one of the best pass catching backs in football. It makes sense as to why they slotted Montgomery basically in that Jamal Williams role that we saw, where Jamal Williams was scoring all those touchdowns. And speaking of touchdowns, that is why you draft David Montgomery, is because he's going to score double-digit touchdowns, because this role in this offense has destroyed in the touchdown column over the last couple of years. We can't deny that. If you look at the split of Montgomery before his injury around week 6, and then he came back week 10, and you look at him from weeks 1 through 5. Now, Gibbs missed some time during this period, but regardless, he had 8 goal line rushes, Montgomery did, to Gibbs's 1. Now, Gibbs, again, missed some time, so I understand if you want to at least throw that out a little bit, but we did see a heavy workload going towards David Montgomery at the goal line during that stretch. He comes back in week 10, and from week 10 through the playoffs, David Montgomery had 11 goal line rushes. Jahmyr Gibbs had 10. David Montgomery's splits went from 20.2 PPR points per game to 13.6. And this is in an offense, like I've been saying, that probably won't score as many touchdowns year over year. So the reason you're drafting David Montgomery might not really be there to the same degree as what we've seen in 2022 and 2023 in this role in the Lions offense. Now, the argument could be, well, there's contingent upside with David Montgomery because if Jahmyr Gibbs goes down, then Montgomery's a bell cow in his offense. My argument against that would be you're paying a premium for that, right? Like you can get
it's T. Higgins. That's literally how T. Higgins has been drafted.
Yeah, true. But you're paying this premium for, at least T. Higgins is playing a position that's really high in demand on like underdog and stuff, right? Like when you can get all of these ambiguous backfield pieces 2 or 3 rounds later than David Montgomery, it just doesn't make, like you have just as much injury upside with one of the Tennessee guys, one of the Cincinnati guys, one of the Pittsburgh guys. You could even say Blake Corum has more injury upside than David Montgomery does, or even like a Zach Charbonnet, who's a high-end handcuff, or even a Ty Chandler. Like there's plenty of double-digit round running backs who maybe don't have the same standalone value and production as David Montgomery does, but we're drafting David Montgomery in that standalone production for a floor and not a ceiling. The ceiling hits whenever the injury happens, and that same ceiling can hit for other running backs throughout your fantasy football draft. So for all those reasons, I just can't get behind him being that RB16, RB17 range. I think that he belongs more in that low end RB2 range. Maybe even you could argue high end RB3.
Yeah, I mean, because Montgomery last year and Jamal Williams the prior year were taken, RB30 and lower. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I'm just going to keep referring to it. When you were saying that, like I was just like, this is the same stuff that this is what's held T. Higgins' ADP up for forever. It's like, man, when Jamar Chase is out, T. Higgins is awesome, and he's okay when Chase plays, and that's basically what it was. When this backfield was in unison, week 10 on. He scored a touchdown in all but 2 games and still only had 1 RB1 scoring week.
Yes, it's a floor play. Even with the touchdowns, it's a floor play. Like I think that people assume that touchdowns equal ceiling. That's not the case when you're not catching passes out of the backfield. It's just not gonna you need to score so many touchdowns for that to be the case, and we're just not gonna likely see that if they're gonna use Jahmyr Gibbs the same way they did down the stretch.
He was scoring. He was scoring touchdowns in that span and still only averaging 13.
Yes.
PPR points per game.
Yes, you that's what I'm saying. You need like a legit, if you're trying to hit a legit ceiling without an injury to Jahmyr Gibbs, you probably need an 18 to 20 touchdown season from David Montgomery. Correct. in order for that to truly come to fruition. And I am 1,000,000% not going to bet on that. There's no chance.
No, I mean, especially some of the guys he goes ahead of, the company he keeps, Alvin Kamara, Kenneth Walker,
yes, yeah.
Guys like that. I brought up guys like Connor and Najee too.
Yep.
Very similar spots that if one of those other guys, it's the contingency value is still there for those guys. It's just not fully priced in because Detroit Lions, running backs the past 2 years have scored, an absolute truckload of touchdowns.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what if they don't? What if Sam Laporta continues to score them all and then I look dumb? So you get double outs.
I mean, look, if Detroit scores 4 touchdowns per game this year, we're gonna ignore the final 10 minutes of this podcast.
We're just gonna have to hope Amon-Ra got us there.
Yeah, we're gonna hope that Jameson Williams has his breakout finally, and that thing's just flipping. They're just targeting their wide receivers a lot. Anyway, Rich, you have a special offer that you want to shout out here before we end this show.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys want to go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com, if you like the cut of my jib or want to read some more stats, like I know that this is the audience for it, right? If you listen to JJ, I'm gonna drop a lot of stuff that's similar wavelength. And if you guys, this is only for your audience that are listening to this podcast here, want to go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com, you can use the promo code DRAFT for the draft kit and get the draft kit that I've been working on the entire summer for just $5. Boom. So just you guys, $5 holler, promo code DRAFT.
Awesome stuff. Anyone listening, definitely take advantage of that offer. Rich, thanks again for hopping on. If anyone's not following Rich and his work over at Sharp Football Analysis, make sure you change that. Follow him on Twitter at Lord Reeves. And you can find me on there at Late Round QB. Make sure you're taking advantage of that underdog offer and you're checking out this year's late round draft guide over on lateround.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with a new episode of Becoming a Best Ball Bro. I'll talk to you then.